So thank you all for coming. As Justin said, I'm a chemist, so I apologize in advance. I'll try to be very clear about what I do, but please, no formalities. If you have any questions, just stop me in the middle and ask. So I'm part of this Autonomous Material Systems here at the Beckman Institute. It's a subgroup in the Beckman Institute. And as the name says, we're trying to develop materials that have some autonomic response to different environmental conditions or different conditions that the materials have to withstand. So for example, we have here the paint in the wall, and with time this paint is going to start drying out and cracking, and then someone needs to come here and take it off and paint it back again. We're trying to develop, for example, the polymer that makes the paint, that when it starts to crack, it will heal itself, for example, or wet itself again. This is the kind of materials you are trying to work on. And obviously, the materials that nature is made of, living materials, biomaterials, already have this feature in them, right? So for example, there are some certain kinds of trees that are under constant wind from one side, for example. They change their structure, their building structure, to adapt to this constant mechanical force. Or even our bones, right? When it cracks or it breaks, it just, we put them back together, but it heals itself alone, autonomically. You don't need to hit it, you don't need to shine light, you don't need to give any extra energy to that. The system is made in such a way that it can just repair itself. So obviously, one of the biggest project in our group, and one of the coolest one, is developing self-healing systems, self-healing materials. And we have three different approaches to that. One is called the intrinsic approach, which basically we do a chemical change to the polymer itself, to the material itself, and this small change is the one that it's going to add this feature of healing. I'll talk a little bit about this in a few. The other two methods, which are not intrinsic, are the ones based on microcapsules, and this was published by a group a long time ago. So basically we have microcapsules where you have a monomer, for example, inside, and you have the catalyst embedded in your polymer matrix. And when you have a crack, it basically ruptures these capsules, and the monomer flows into the crack and basically gets polymerized and closes the crack up. And this is a very interesting system. It's already even being commercialized. Recently, we've been working on vascular systems. So we basically make materials that have hollow channels in them, and again we can pass, for example, a healing system, a monomer, through these channels, and when you have a crack, it opens up these channels. The liquid can come into the crack, fill the crack up, polymerize, and close the crack. Now, these three different systems are being developed in our group, and there isn't a best one, right? They have different applications. So this obviously is a very complicated system, and you can use it, for example, for airplane ships or hulls, or something that it's very complicated, and the damage gap that it can heal is much larger than this system, which has its own properties, and this is the one I've been working on. And the advantages of this system, first of all, it's very simple. You basically have to add a different molecule when you're making your polymer to incorporate it to your system. You don't have industrial problems when making your material. It's very homogeneous, so it distributes very homogeneously through your material. Obviously, these two systems are less homogeneous. The best feature of this system is that it can act before failure. So in these two cases, you need to have an actual crack that ruptures a capsule or the channel in order to get the healing. In this case, if you have a mechanical force that will induce a crack, this can already start activating the chemistry. So instead of having a self-healing system, you have a self-reinforcing system that will respond to that mechanical force. It heals at the molecular level, meaning that it's going to act on the chains that make the material and not make a new material to close up a gap. And it's very local. So in those cases, you may have this monomer or this liquid coming out of your material, of your crack. In this case, it's going to be only where the mechanical force is concentrated. The disadvantages of the system is it's limited by diffusion. So in those cases, you have a solvent that makes the healing system go to the place that you want. In here, it's everything solid state. So it can't move too much around. And you have to make some small changes to the original material, which hopefully will not change the mechanical properties of that material. So how do we do that? So we chemists are used to induce chemical changes using mostly heat, right? We take two molecules, put them together, heat it, and this is the energy that we need in order to make a chemical transformation. There are several examples also of electrochemistry, when you apply a current to make the chemical change, or UV or light-induced chemical change. There are several examples also of pressure. So you basically, if you want to do a reaction with a gas, you increase the pressure of this gas up to where you can get this reaction. Examples of mechanically induced chemistry are much rarer, and it's something kind of new in chemistry. At least it's not something that you will learn in undergrad or grad school. It's something really at the research level at this point. And basically, as any new field, we have several questions that we need to answer to develop this system. Basically, how can we do selective chemical reactions induced by mechanical force? This is a very important question. We chemists like to take A plus B and get C, and only C, and not different products. What's the force that I have to apply in order to induce a chemical change? The analytical chemistry. So I have a huge polymer where I have one small group that it's going to change to undergo a chemical reaction. How can I analyze, how can I see these changes in such a small molecule inside all this polymer? And but the impact that it may have on materials is huge. So sensors of mechanical history is something that we've developed for almost 10 years now, and it's working very good. But basically, this is what my project is about: post-processing modification, which means you make your material, you make your polymer, you put it in the mold, you make your final product. How is it going to change after all this processing? So we are going to change some chemistry in there that it's going to change some of the mechanical properties, for example, of the material. Now it turns out that it's not such a new field after all. Mechanochemistry has been known, so this is a paper from the 40s, and it's been known before that. So people knew already that applying mechanical force to materials changes the potential of the chemical bonds. The thing is, people always studied that as a negative process. So if you have a polymer and you apply mechanical force, you're going to break your chain. And this is what people were used to study, how the mechanical force is negatively impacting the materials that we have. And no one really had thought about using this chemical reaction to produce enhanced performance instead of just breaking it down. And this is what the mechanochemistry project is about. So this new mechanochemistry is quite new. It has maybe 15 years. And several materials have been developed using this new science, this new chemistry. And basically, people made different polymers where when you apply mechanical force, they self-heal, exactly what we're trying to do. Some of the materials, like this one, are even as strong as epoxy resins, which are very, very strong materials. The thing is, all the materials that were developed up to now, most of them still need an extra source of energy, such as light or heat. There are a few of them that are really autonomous, but they are special materials. So no one was still able to develop a system that you add to a common polymer and add the feature of self-healing to this polymer. And that's what we are trying to do. So all these systems are based on the oldest self-healing system, the oldest known self-healing system, and that's vulcanized rubber. which is known to be self-healing for a long time. So this is vulcanized isoprene, polyisoprene. And so this is one polyisoprene chain. This is another one. And when you vulcanize, you add sulfur. And what you make is these cross links made of sulfur chains. So when you apply mechanical force to that, these sulfur chains, these sulfur-sulfur bonds are much weaker than these carbon-carbon bonds or even the carbon-sulfur bonds. So when you apply mechanical force, these sulfur-sulfur bonds just break apart and you produce two sulfur radicals in each case. These sulfur radicals can then recombine or just react with one of the double bonds and reform the bonds that were broken. So that's how the system self-heals. So learning from this system, in order to develop something that works, you need long-lived reactive species. So in this case, sulfur radicals, they are quite long-lived as long as they don't have oxygen. They have to be at high local concentrations. In this case, the concentrations are between 5 and 20%, depending on the rubber. And there is the question of mobility. Rubber are soft systems, so there is some mobility to the chains, so they can actually get to the other reagent and make a new bond. So how can we incorporate these three systems to a completely different polymer like polyethylene or polymethyl methacrylate? So instead of having making two reagents, we thought maybe if we use an acid, if we produce an acid, maybe we can reach all these properties. So acids are long-lived, they are perfectly stable, and they are very reactive, as all of you know. They are very mobile, because an acid is basically a proton. It's the smallest chemical structure you can have. So if something can move around in the solid state, that's it. If this doesn't move in the solid state, larger things are not going to move. Now, local concentration can be a problem, so we can produce a lot of acid by having, for example, an acid amplifier. But in this case, the acid is not our reagent. The acid is a catalyst. So if I add, instead, I don't need to produce too much acid. What I need to have is between 5 and 20% of a monomer, a co-monomer, that is sensitive to acid, that will undergo some acid-catalyzed reaction. So I can produce a very small quantity of a catalyst that will induce a high concentration, a high quantity of a reaction. And maybe this will give the features that we want. So obviously we don't want the acid there all the time, so I'm not going to add acid to my polymer. I need to add the feature that when I apply mechanical force, I will produce an acid. Now, there are thermally produced acids. So for example, this molecule, when you heat it, it will produce acid. There are photoacid generators. When I shine UV light, they produce acid. There are electrical generated acids. So this molecule, if I oxidize it, it will produce acids. But there were no examples of mechanogenerated acids. And this is the first step that we need to overcome in order to develop this system. So my work basically started looking at other people's work. And this work by Craig from Duke University, he showed that this chemical group, which is called dichlorocyclopropane, and when you apply mechanical force to it, it undergoes a chemical reaction. So basically, you open this cyclopropane, and you make a new double bond, and the chloride jumps to the carbon besides it. The interesting thing about this is that when he took the same polymer and heated it, he produced a lot of acid. So we looked at this and we said, how can we change this in order for this to go to this pathway and not this pathway? And again, looking at the literature, it was shown a long time ago that if you have this dichlorocyclopropane embedded in a different cyclic system with a double bond, then if you produce, for example, this molecule by the same rearrangement reaction, then this molecule will undergo spontaneous at room temperature release of acid to produce this aromatic system, this benzene ring, which is much, much more stable than this one. So you have a driving force for the release of acid after the rearrangement. So we said, great, let's prepare a system like this. So we basically, this is the chemical synthesis. I won't go through this. But basically, what we made is this small molecule, incorporated it into the polymer. It has the dichlorocyclopropane in the 5-membered ring with the double bond here. And basically, our idea is that if we apply mechanical force to that, maybe it will undergo the 2 steps and do elimination, produce the acid, and aromatization is what's going to drive this last step forward. So basically, this is the molecule that I made. It has 2 methacrylate groups, one on each side, so that it can bind the polymer from both sides. We polymerized methyl acrylate, a common monomer, in the presence of this as a cross-linker. So we just get a thermoset where we have this group cross-linking between the chains. And the idea again is that when I apply mechanical force to that, the force will go through the chains, make this chemical reaction, and release acid, 1 acid for each group in this case. For our control, I take the same molecule and I don't put the methacrylate groups, and I just polymerize using a different cross-linker, get the same kind of architecture, but in this time, this group is not part of the polymer. It's just a small molecule inside the polymer matrix. So when I apply mechanical force to it, the mechanical force is not going through this molecule. It's just going through the polymer chains. And then when I apply mechanical force, it's not going to produce the acid. So this chemical reaction is very exothermic, as I said before. This is much more stable than this. So in order to analyze our material, we use DSC. Basically, it's a colorimetric analytical system. If I have, for example, just polymer PMA and I change the temperature, you just see this common change. But if I have something that releases energy when undergoes a chemical reaction in there, as the temperature goes up, at some point I'll reach a temperature that the reaction will occur, and it's going to release energy. So you see a peak. So basically, for my polymer and my control polymer, I got peaks because both of them have the mechanophore in it. I have this dichlorocyclopropane. When I heat it, they undergo this reaction, release acid and energy. So basically what I do, I take the polymer, I put it in a press, apply compression, mechanical force, and then I measure this again, and I see the decrease in this peak. Then I integrate those peaks, I compare what I have afterwards to what I had before, and then you can just make a simple graph and measure how much did you activate, how much did you lose of that molecule. So applying different pressures, different mechanical force. In the case of my system, the activation goes up. The control case, there is some small activation, around 5%. It's probably thermal, but it's unrelated to how much mechanical force I'm applying. Now, I demonstrated that I'm losing that molecule that I incorporated. It's reacting, but am I producing acid? So for that, it's very simple. I just take these 2 polymers and I add some pH indicator. And in this case, the pH indicator changes color to indicate there is acid in there. This one doesn't show any acid. Also, I'm a chemist, so I have to demonstrate chemically the change that I am proposing. So for that, I used Raman spectroscopy. So basically, if I have the small molecule and I heat it up, it's becoming the aromatic system. So I get new peaks, new double bond peaks in the Raman. I do the same thing. I take the polymer, I compress it, and I look at the Raman, and again the same peaks appear in the Raman, showing that those same double bonds are being produced. So basically that's our first generation mechanical acid. We basically incorporate this into the polymer. We apply mechanical force. It undergoes this rearrangement that was demonstrated before, and then just thermally it undergoes another reaction producing the acid that we wanted. Now this was a very good, nice proof of concept, but it's still not good enough for real life applications, and that's mostly because of it's thermally unstable. So the control showed 5% activation. You don't want to have 5% acid being produced during the lifetime of your compound just thermally. So we need a more stable system that can live for a longer time. And for that, we went to develop a new mechanogenerating acid. And for that, we decided to look at photoacid generators, which are very thermally stable. So the most common form of, most used form photoacid generators is the sulfonium salt. So the mechanism by which it works is that when you shine UV light, you break this carbon-sulfur bond, produce two radicals. The sulfonium radicals is extremely reactive. It basically absorbs and abstracts an hydrogen from anywhere around that it can, and basically it produces the acid that we want. And we were thinking, well, can we do this same reaction by mechanical force? So basically, if I take the sulfonium salt, I put it from both arms at the same time, maybe I will be able to break this same carbon-sulfur bond and produce the same intermediate. The same intermediate will react by the same way and produce an acid. So just to test this possibility, we do something called a CoGEF, which is a quantum mechanical simulation. And basically what we do, we take this molecule, we tell the computer, minimize this molecule, which means just change all the bonds and angles until you get to the lowest energy possible. So that lowest energy possible we call 0. And then we take the two arms, so the two last carbons, and we say, okay, this is the distance of equilibrium. Increase it by a little bit and minimize again, but keep that distance constant. Increase it a little bit more, increase it a little bit more, increase it a little bit more. And obviously the energy will go up, because when it was that equilibrium distance, it was the equilibrium, it was the lowest energy. And this extra distance is going to be distributed through all the bonds between the arms, up to some level where it gets to such an energy that it's easier for this molecule just to break one bond and just have two separate molecules. So when this happens, we want to see what bond is going to break. Is the carbon-sulfur bond, which is the one that we want, or maybe one of the other bonds. And indeed, the bond that breaks is the carbon-sulfur bond. So this is a very good indication that this system can work the way that we want. The synthesis, contrary to the last one, is very simple. It's just 1 or 2 steps. And then we have the sulfonium salt ready for polymerization. We have different polymerization methods that we can use this. So controlled radical polymerizations is it's the best one, just because you can make almost any polymer this way, but also polyadditions, polycondensations for different polymers. So we just take this molecule, we add again methyl acrylate as the monomer, and make this polymerization using a copper catalyst. And we got a very good polymer. The problem was that when we looked at the NMR, we found out that this structure had already decomposed during the polymerization. So it seems that this sulfonium salt is not stable towards copper. It's stable to high temperature, but it's not stable towards copper. By the way, the polymerization by polycondensation works quite well. So we were able to make polyurethanes, for example, and in this case, the NMR showed that the structure keeps constant. And it's still a photoacid generator, so it's very nice that you can just shine UV light in the presence of a pH indicator and see that the structure is still there and still works. But if you look at this structure, this is not a common polyurethane. This is a polyurethane that has a lot of this specific monomer that I use, and that's not the kind of material that I want to do. So I went back to radical polymerization and I looked what other metals can be used to make these polymers. So if you look at the literature, 99% of these radical ATRP and acetyl-RP polymerizations are done using copper. There are other examples using osmium, ytterbium, iridium. There are also ruthenium examples. This came out very recently in a very good paper, and I decided to try that. It uses visible light to induce the polymerization, and it's kind of a nice reaction to do in the lab. So basically, you have your polymerization solution in there, and you shine visible light in it, and then you can make the polymer. So basically, you use this iridium visible light, and you get your polymer. It gives a decent-sized polymer with good polydispersity. And again, you just dissolve it, and you shine UV light to see that your structure is still there, and you produce some acid, then it means that it's good. So this is our second generation mechanoacid. I still have not tested it mechanically, it's undergoing, but basically this one has several advantages over the first one. It's thermally stable, it has a much higher activation energy, it's very easy to make, and it can be used also in thermoplastics. The first one cannot be used, and we can incorporate it to a huge quantity of different polymers just by using ATRP, using this iridium catalyst. So I'll talk a little bit about applications. Luckily for us, photoresists are very important in the world today, and many of them are based on photoacid generators. So it's very nice because they give us already the chemistry that we are looking for to make the different applications that we want. So we are producing the acids mechanically and not by light, so the application is obviously not lithography, but this gives us already the chemistry that is being done in solid state using acid was already developed. So there are positive photoresists, negative photoresists. Positive photoresists, you have your polymer, where you shine light, it becomes more soluble, or it, for example, it depolymerizes. You have a polymer, you shine UV light, it becomes a monomer again, then it's soluble, you can take it off. And the negative is the opposite. When you shine light, it becomes cross-linked and becomes insoluble, and that's actually the chemistry that we want for self-healing system, making new bonds inside your material. So I'll just talk a little bit about this type of system, which is much easier to work than this one. One of the most commonly used polymers for positive photoresist is called PPA, polyphtalhaldehyde, which is this polymer. You have this repeating unit in your material, and this polymer is very interesting because if you just polymerize it, and the polymerization is done at very low temperature, when you heat it up, it will already depolymerize, unless you end cap it. You add chemical groups in the end that like cap the polymer on both sides. So basically, it's a very interesting polymer that if you remove one of the end caps or break any bond in the middle of the polymer, it will completely depolymerize and go back to this monomer. So the main chain of the polymer is made of this carbon which is bound to two oxygens. This is called an acetal, and this group is extremely sensitive to acid. So if you have a photoacid generator, you produce acid. In this polymer, it's going to react with any of these bonds in the chain, and it's going to depolymerize. So it seems like a very good point to start developing applications for our mechanogenerating acids. The thing is, we were thinking, maybe I don't need the acid at all. If I break any bond in the chain, it's going to depolymerize. Maybe I don't need the mechanoacid at all. And we decided to study that. So basically, we take this polymer in solution, we apply mechanical force using high energy ultrasound, and indeed, if you just do the reaction over time, apply mechanical force by ultrasonication, you see that the peak of the polymer the area starts going down at the same concentration. So basically what you see is that the polymer concentration is going down. The polymer is completely disappearing. So this is very nice, but obviously you need controls to prove that this is being done by mechanical force. So for example, if you take another polymer, a different polymer that does not undergo depolymerization, such as polymethyl acrylate, and you apply mechanical force, you see that there is also a change, right? So this peak starts going down. On the other hand, a peak which is around half the molecular weight starts going up, which is what you expect when you take a polymer and you break it in two. Also, one thing that I didn't say before is that in order for this mechanical force to be enough to break a carbon-oxygen bond in this case, you need at least a certain size to the polymer. If the polymer is too small, then you cannot pass enough force to break a chemical bond. So this gives us a different control, which is just taking the same polymer and using a much smaller one. So in this case, you have a 25 kilodaltons PPA, the same polymer, the same chemical structure, just smaller. And when you apply ultrasonication to that, no changes observed. So basically, just to summarize that, you can integrate all these areas, and you see that the area doesn't change for the two controls, but it goes down with time for the PPA case until it doesn't go to zero, because again, what remains here is too small to break in the middle. So we decided there are several mathematical modelings to the change of the molecular weight distribution of the polymer as a consequence of degradation. This is one model that we've been using for different cases. Basically, it says that for each molecular weight, the signal for each the concentration for each molecular weight is made from basically the previous one. Then you lose in each step some of it, which depends on a certain rate and the distance of the size of the polymer to the limiting molecular weight for degradation. And then you have a gain factor, which is basically what's the chance that a higher molecular weight is going to break into and give exactly that molecular weight. So you have a decrease factor, and then a gain factor. And we said, okay, for the depolymerization, basically what we have to do is take this one out, because we are not gaining any new polymer, because when it breaks, it completely depolymerizes. So you just use a simpler mathematical model, and when you make this one and compare to the experimental data, it fits quite well. Now, an interesting thing about this system is that, as I said, it depolymerizes to the monomer. So there is something very nice that we can do, is that we can repolymerize it. So we are producing a monomer in one place, maybe, so we can move it to a different place, give a chemical signal, and repolymerize it in a different place. So this is very similar to what happens, for example, in our bones, where the bonds are all the time depolymerizing and repolymerizing, and this is basically how the system works and heals itself. So this is called regeneration and remodeling. So we were thinking maybe we can use this PPA system to develop a regeneration remodeling system. So basically, we apply mechanical force and we break it, as we showed before. Can we now repolymerize the monomer that we produced, even in the presence of whatever didn't decompose here? And that's what it did. So basically, this is a gel permeation chromatography. The blue one is the remaining polymer that did not depolymerize during the mechanical stress. And then we take the same solution, put an initiator in there, we do the polymerization again, and we get a new polymer with lower molecular weight in this case, but just to show you that we can make new polymer in there while keeping the previous one in there. So basically, we developed mechanically triggered depolymerization instead of a light-induced depolymerization, chemically induced depolymerization. Basically, having PPA of enough size, when you apply mechanical force, it undergoes depolymerization. And we don't need a mechanophore for that. We don't need the acid producing mechanophore in there. We can use a mathematical model to show how the molecular weight distribution is going to change. And basically, we show that the monomer that is produced by depolymerization can be repolymerized, so we can develop a completely new system that can have a material that can undergo regeneration and remodeling. Just to give a little bit about the systems that we are working on, the self-healing, so in this case the other type of photoresist. Glycidyl methacrylates are commonly used as photoresists, and you have acid catalyzed cross-linking through these epoxide opening reactions. And polybutadiene undergoes a cyclization reaction in the presence of acid. This one is going quite well. So basically we need an acid amplifier because the acid we produce is not enough. But if you take a very low molecular weight, polybutadiene, it's a liquid or it's a gel. It's it's a very viscous gel. And when we give it enough acid, it becomes solid, even brittle solid. So it seems that this is the system we are going to work mostly on. The acid catalyzed reaction makes a significant mechanical change to this material. So just to finish, I'd like to thank Professor Moore for allowing me to work in this amazing project and very promising project. Dr. Silberstein is a postdoc in the Soros group. She helps me with all the engineering part of this project, and I'm extremely thankful for her because I'm not an engineer and I have a huge gap in this area. Different postdocs and PhD students who worked with me in these different projects. Naoto was a visiting student from Japan who brought most of the results in the first mechanoacid generator. Brian was a previous postdoc who started this project, and other people who worked in these and different projects. Professors White, Sotos, and Braun are the other professors in the AMS group that are helping me through different ways, especially their students. The Moore group and the AMS group for support in the day-to-day and the funding for paying for all this. And, thank you.
Anybody have questions?
So you mentioned how your mechanically triggered polymers could be used as, say, maybe a replacement for conventional photoresists. Have you thought about one application that comes to mind is nano imprint lithography, where you have very, very tightly patterned pillars and they press into a mold. And that the lithography limits are actually lower than what you can achieve with, say, conventional photolithography processes. So that might be, I mean, it's just more of a comment than a question. It might be an application for some of these rapidly depolymerizing compounds with mechanical force. It'd be through the sort of nano imprint, which is the next generation of lithography tools.
Yeah, I'm certain it can be done. I actually thought the opposite was the right one. I thought that you can make thinner lines of light than you could do of mechanical things. Because I mean, obviously I understand that most of the nano imprinted things are made by light.
The problem is that you have like when you have like cross-linking polymers, you have the light scatters off the sidewalls of your feature in question, so you get a wider definition for the feature due to the light, due to the power of the light, because it's not all incident. Power is not all incident, right? It's straight where you expose, but it's rather the sidewalls. The mechanical force might be much more, say, anisotropic. You might get very good definition. Just another possible application for your mechanical.
Yeah, I'm certain it could. It can be done. Even with the first one, so it has problems of thermal stability, but it's not. I mean, in this case, you wouldn't care about doing this at low temperature. And also quite fast, so you can basically make your polymer, leave it in solution at low temperature, do the film of your polymer, and straight ahead imprint your material. So yeah, it definitely can be done.
Is there would the limit in such a system be the size of the monomer in the polymer?
So the size of a monomer is Armstrongs. The size of these polymers are between, so it's around 50 Armstrongs. So the sizes here are extremely small.
The edited fluorophore methyl red shows a color change along with the mechanochemical responsiveness. Right, yeah. So your polymers is sorry, for your polymer solutions, right?
So if I just make a polymer solution, the methyl red is a pH indicator, right? It has one color at a certain pH, and the pH goes below certain color, certain value changes the color. So if you just take your polymer and dissolve in acetonitrile, which is the solvent that I used, it's not really dissolving because it's a cross-linked polymer. I'm just adding the solvent, the polymer to the solvent. So the pH does not change. Okay, but in the second case, I had already pressed this polymer, and it's producing acid, and the acid is in the polymer. So when I take this polymer and I add to the solution, the acid will leave the polymer and go to the solution and react with the pH indicator and change the color of the pH indicator.
It's just a generic question. But you said you were talking about the self-healing part, right? So can you put the characteristic into any polymer? You were talking about the paint self-healing, whitening itself, or replacing the cracks over time. Can you put this characteristic into any polymer? Can you engineer it into anything, or is it application specific? Like you got to find that application and cater a particular molecule, or can you?
So the true answer is that I don't know, because I haven't done that yet. We expect that we are going to have problems in polymers that are very rigid. So with TG very high, the diffusion of the acid is still going to be quite low. So even, for example, with the photoresist, right? You shine the UV light, you produce acid, but if you don't bake the polymer, you don't put it in the oven, no reaction is going to occur, because you still need this extra temperature, this extra heat for some of the reactions or for the proton to move. So I don't know yet. This second generation mechanoacid generator, it can be incorporated in theory in any polymer that it's not made by anionic polymerization. Anionic polymerization is a limitation. But most polymers that are made by anionic polymerization can be done by other methods. So, for example, cationic polymerization or radical polymerization. So now, the one that is mostly done by, for example, one very important one that is done by anionic polymerization is polyethylene. So Ziegler-Natta catalyst is an ionic polymerization. So, but again, you can make polyethylene by other methods. So it can be incorporated to most polymers. If it's going to work or not, that's a question. And another factor is, as I said, we need to add 5%, between 5 and 20% of a comonomer, something that reacts with the acid. So how is it going to change the properties of that material? That is going to be different in each polymer. So polyethylene, if you add 5% of glycidyl methacrylate, I guess it's going to change a lot the properties, or its properties. But if you add it to polymethyl methacrylate, then it's okay. I mean, it's almost the same.
Anybody else have questions? Let's thank Dr. Diesendrup again.